I first heard this presentation on the last summer during the city-sponsored speakers series. And it was fascinating, all about Buchanan Cellars, and we got a tour of Buchanan Cellars, thanks to Mary their fridge. And it was so good that I came back and told Lynn about it and said, you should really show us, because it's just amazing the history that we have here in McMinnville about this building. And I'm so tempted to just start talking, but I will let there do it. Anyway, a little bit about Mary Beth. Mary Beth Branch has been working as a residential and commercial designer in Yamhill County since graduating from the University of Oregon with a bachelor's in architecture and minors in interior architecture and architectural history. She formed her own design firm in 2014, and in 2019, she established a design and build firm, Branch Gary Incorporated. She's completed numerous projects since, ranging from remodels to new construction. What Mary Beth most loves about her work is building relationships with clients that far outlast any project timeline. Mary Beth has also dedicated her time to local nonprofit and governmental agencies since moving back to McMinnville in 2010. Her roles as a past treasurer of the McMinnville Downtown Association and the current vice chair of the City of McMinnville's Historic Landmarks Committee. Yes, she will take your questions about the Gwendolyn. Giving her valuable insight into the nuances of projects, especially those involving historic structures. When not designing or on a job site, you'll find Mary Beth, along with her husband Brian, trying to keep up with and fully entertained by their two young kids, Houston and Garnett. Please help me welcome Mary Beth Branch.
Thank you for the probably not deserved, a very kind introduction. I think that what Denise left out of her story of when she first heard me speak, I'm pretty sure it was the summer where it was about 104 degrees outside. And I am an exaggerator, and I am pretty sure that was like a documented temperature check that day. And we did the presentation and tour of the Buchanan Cellars Mill building on the second floor in our large, what we call our warehouse area. And if it's 104 outside, it's like 120 in there, and then you transplant yourself to like Louisiana, and it's that level of, it was brutal, and they stuck through it, and this is a much more pleasant environment. So next time it's 104, I'm going to remember that this place exists, and we'll do it here instead. I tend to talk too much, so I'm going to try to semi-stay on this script here, and also try not to bounce around too much. But if at any point I start doing something weird or someone's confused or whatever, I don't have any boundaries. I don't want you to have any either. So please just yell or raise your hand and tell me to pause or rewind or whatever, and we'll do that. And then I can stick around at the end too if people have questions about this building, about historic preservation in McMinnville in general. I've been on the Historic Landmarks Committee for, it's been longer than my daughter's been alive, so 7 years now. And is a real passion of mine too. So I'm happy to answer any questions about that or talk through anything related to all those good things. So I found when I was going through my many random bags of things here, some pretty hilarious things that I'm going to share with you today. I think we should answer it. They might want to join us. There is one, this is undated, and I'm not sure here. My friend CB, who is representing Buchanan Cellars, the whole kind of business operation is here today too. So also if you have any questions about you need some cat food, or you want to know about some chicken feed, or any random question for the business, she either knows the answer or she knows who to call to get the answer. So she'll be here for a little bit today too. But I found this, I'm not sure what this is dated from. It's not 135 years old, but it's also not within the last 20 years either. So, but I love this quote. And it's about Yamhill County. And there's a picture at the bottom from 1902 of local farmers bringing in sacks of grain to be ground into flour by the milling company in McMinnville. These will all be up at the table here at the end if you want to come and look at these pictures. And we'll look at some of them on the screen too. But I think this is an actual advertisement like in a newspaper. McMinnville in Yamhill County advertises itself as, McMinnville is old enough to be substantial, young enough to be ambitious, big enough to be industrious, and small enough to be friendly. And I love this. And I think it was true then, and it's true now. And we have to keep it that way as long as we are able. Buchanan Cellars Building. She, and you should know all of my pronouns for inanimate objects are female, to which my son takes great offense, but I'm not going to change my ways. So when you get confused, I really am probably talking about something that is not human. Buchanan Cellars is an old building. It's getting close to being 135, or is it? It is 135 years old. Yeah. I don't know what month construction finished, but we'll just go with that. I am here today, in the broader sense, involved in this project in this building because of family, as so many of us seems to be the path that takes us to interesting places. I moved to McMinnville right before I started high school at Matt High, longer ago than I'm going to admit up here today. Just had a birthday that felt kind of like a bigger one that rounds up to a number I'm not quite ready for. But I'm a Matt High grad, moved here from Alabama, and so have kind of an interesting story, I suppose, but moved here with my mom to be close to her sister, Margaret Legard, who passed away in 2013. But some of you that have been residents of McMinnville for a while, I hope, remember her. And I know if you remember her, you remember her fondly. She was a remarkable woman for so many different reasons, but was really the front and face of the Buchanan Cellars building and the family operations and that church and downtown and everything. And so when she passed away, it took just about every member of our family, and there's a lot of us, to try to fill in the gaps of what we lost when she left us. And I take on this one little small role of trying to educate members of the community about the building and kind of our stewardship of it and plans for it moving forward, and giving tours of it in, oh my gosh, like I cannot even get close to doing it the way that she did before, but I'm always doing my best. So she, however, is the one that put in just hundreds and hundreds of hours and research back in the late, kind of the 2005 to 2010 years to place the Buchanan Cellars mill property individually on the National Register of Historic Places, which was finalized in 2012. That is significant because it is the only, if not one of the only, independently listed buildings on the National Park Service's National Register list of historic properties. Our historic downtown corridor of 3rd Street and certain areas around it is listed on the National Register as that historic district, and certain buildings are called out within that district as being significant, which if anyone's been reading the paper for a few months with the Gwendolyn Hotel, you probably heard some of this language. But Buchanan Cellars is actually like separately listed individually as its own structure, which is really significant and not all that common and takes a lot of work. So we are really, really proud of that accomplishment and proud to still be here as stewards of the building today. Outside of the historic downtown district, the Buchanan Cellars Mill was constructed in 1888. And it is one of, I'm going to switch real quick here. It is one of McMinnville's oldest industrial commercial buildings, and one of only a handful of tangible reminders of the city's agricultural beginnings, specifically that a flour milling business once flourished in McMinnville. And some would say it might have been the heart of the industry in the McMinnville at its creation. Indeed, the building is the last remaining intact flour mill building within the city limits. It's one of the last intact flour mill buildings, not only in Oregon, but actually in the entire West Coast, too. Especially because it's built out of wood, as were a lot of its friends. And wood buildings catch on fire. So we're very thankful that she's still here today. The building's status as an anchor at McMinnville's original industrial district has persisted, as it now anchors the area, the Granary District, and more newly, the Alpine Avenue District. It is currently recognized for its commitment to locally owned and operated commercial, industrial, and agricultural businesses, like so many of our neighbors. As the city's sole remaining flour mill building, the continued presence of this building solidifies a piece of McMinnville's past amidst a changing economy and streetscape. The old flour mill building looms tall in northeast McMinnville. Its presence is a comfort and constant. And while change is imminent and guaranteed, the preservation of McMinnville's only remaining flour mill building is an essential link between the agricultural past and our emerging future. This picture that you'll see up on the biggest TV I have ever seen is an original kind of edited photograph from 1888 showing the original part of the building in its original form. So one of the really, like she mentioned, my degree is in architecture. The work I do is in architectural design and some preservation elements too. And one of the things that's most striking and interesting about this particular building is that it has gone through 3 or 4 stages of kind of more dramatic development or changes to its exterior shape and size, height, use, all of these different things. But all of the pieces of its history still remain. So this original 4-story building with its heavy timber post and beam structure is still there in the building today. It just has parts of buildings that are added on top of it. So when you're inside the building, even if you're able to just come and be on the first floor, which is where that Buchanan Cellars retail store operations are open now, you can walk along the first floor and see like 5 different examples of construction, like styles, techniques, materials, all through this kind of one building, which I think is so interesting. When this, you'll see it's just the 4-story with the double hung windows that you kind of still see today. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And you'll notice this, you probably can't really see my little icon here, but the roof line here, it used to be the original, top of the roof, is something that you probably recognize today, although in a different form. So this picture was taken sometime between 1918 and 1924. The change here being that there is a boiler room and kind of side added to the west side of the building, this sort of small area here that no longer exists. That's not true. It exists the way that it is now, but it's shown here, but it's bigger. And then we jump to kind of similar time period between 1918 and 1924, that side of the west building here got a little bit bigger. And then you start to see the beginnings of sort of large awning along 5th Street that there's an awning there now, but it's not in that exact location. What you also see is a little hint of this corrugated metal here, which is the first version of what we call the warehouse building. So I talked about this building as it's like 3 different buildings. I have a little photo I'll show you in a minute, which is the key of like the Mary Beth language of understanding what in the world I'm talking about. Because it's not necessarily the way any historian would say it, but we all have to learn to just talk like me because I can't change, it turns out. On the back side of the building, this is a view from around 1945. And this is looking at the back of the building as if you were in the big back gravel parking lot by the grain station. And showing you this little thing on top here was one of the original versions of the 5th story of the building, which has had a couple of different looks, and that is not how it exists today. And what you also see here, which is a really kind of interesting example and something that's really unique about milling buildings, especially gravity-fed mill buildings, which is what this building was built to be, which is why it's 5 stories tall and it's smaller on top and it's bigger and bigger as it goes down. That raw material was actually dropped off like the farmers back in 1902 in their like wagons with horses. They came with their just like burlap sacks or actually they didn't have burlap sacks then. So it was really just like the back of their wagon full of raw graded material. And then they would come to the backside of the building under what we call now the kind of float out bend area. And they would unload their raw materials, which would then be put into the first floor of the building and were carried with these little, we call them elevator legs. And they look like metal, like a column, but like a post kind of, a rectangular metal, galvanized metal post that's about twice as big as this wood post kind of sitting right here in the middle of this room here. But inside they were hollow. It's kind of like a conveyor belt, but instead of just a belt, it has these little metal scoops. So it would come and it would scoop up the raw material, carry it all the way up, dump it at the top at the 5th story, and then the gravity-fed processing system would happen from there. So then it went all the way up, processed, and then by the time it got back down to the 2nd floor, that's where it was bagged in burlap sacks eventually. Before that, it was actually just dumped back into the back of someone's wagon as then a processed flowering material and then taken away. So that was kind of like what you did for that day when you were the farmer. You brought it into town, you waited for it to get processed, and then you brought it home. And these funky looking things we're looking at here are what we call the crib bins, which would have been storage tanks or bins, in the back of the building, which exist right now, but they're covered with metal siding, so you can't really see what's behind them. But if you can see here, and it's an old photo, we have a newer one kind of coming up, but I'll zoom in a little bit just on that corner here. A traditional wood-framed wall, we would have, 2x4 or 2x6 wood studs, and we'd do them right vertically like this, and there'd be a top plate and a bottom plate, and it's kind of hollow in between. So for crib bins like this, when they were constructed, they're very, very, very sturdy, but it's a combination of 2x6 lumber and 2x4 lumber. So they're these skinny, strips of wood that are stacked like this to make the wall. And then on the corner where they start to look, that all this an interesting thing happens, is because on the corner they overlapped this way, if that makes sense. So kind of like a beautiful piece of old furniture, you would look inside and see how the corners were like dovetailed together. That's how the corner of these huge structures are made. And let's see. Okay, guys, back out. We talked a little bit about those earlier photos, how on the west side, there was like a little teeny kind of addition added. There was a boiler room along that west side addition at some point very early on in the building's existence. In the early 1940s through 1945, that small western addition was taken down, and the large western addition to the building, like we see it now, so this is what's the alleyway between, it's like our Stewart building and kind of their production facilities, and there's an alley, and then the Buchanan Cellars building on 5th Street. This is what you see there today. But this is a cool photo because it shows you how this is that original 4-story building, and then you see on top how there's a 5th story that's been built above that 4th-story building, but that original roof line is still there up at the top. And then you can actually see inside these photos a little bit that like this is an original double hung window, and some super smart architect at the time was like, well, I want my roof to be here, so we'll just cut the windows in half and put it on right here. But when you're inside the building right now, up on that 4th floor, you can actually like peer into the little bottom part of that window on that original exterior wall. And then this siding material here, which was like it's not totally a tongue and groove, but it sort of is. You can see the profile of it on the exterior of the building on the 1st floor, but there's original Doug fir wood siding that was the exterior of the building and now is actually the interior of this wall inside. So it was like all of it's still there. It just got kind of added onto from there. And so then this western addition became a 3-story addition like it is now, and really expanded the overall square footage on the western side of the building at that time. This photo is showing you what it looked like once that addition was done, that western addition, and looks a little more familiar to what you would see now. And then is also showing you the fifth story. And this is actually, this is the fifth story, how it exists today as well. So before we saw it, it was this little tiny little tower, and now it's got a slightly larger. The fifth story roof construction and what we call the warehouse roof construction, which you can only see had a smidge of right here, are the only parts of the buildings that actually have a more traditional, like stick-framed construction. It's not the heavy post and beam timber, and has, well, I call them trusses for the roofs. Our structural engineer is like, it might look like a truss, but it's not. That's not a truss. So we're working through that. Working through lots of those little things, it turns out. So it has a different kind of roof structure, which also shows, the advances in kind of building science, and also that we didn't just have these big, huge Doug-fir beams at our disposal to use like we could back in 1888. And then we get closer to this building is taken, or this picture was taken by either Margaret or Jerry Lee or my aunt and uncle right after or soon after they purchased this building. So it has been in the Leagard. They have owned it, and now their oldest son, Jay Leagard, is the general manager and also partial owner, along with his two siblings that own the property itself. And this is what it looks like then. And it's not really all that different now. Okay, I'm going to do a little trick question here, see if people are paying attention. And I apologize, because this may not be about paying attention. It may be more about eyesight. So I'm not going to be mad if you don't know the answer. But raise your hand if you were looking at this picture from like the late 40s. If you can tell me something that's different about the building in this picture versus in this picture here, and also what it's like today. Yes. The window. That is absolutely correct. There are two major differences, all related to that same thing. So when we look back at this picture from the late 40s, and then we also look back, way back when we had these beautiful, I keep saying double hung. A lot of the windows are actually single hung, but that's sort of irrelevant to most people other than me. That the windows are these beautiful, tall, rectangular shaped, right, with 4/4 glass panes. And then when you come down to, well, it's funny how this is not present day, but it might as well be, they're like just squares, right? The other thing that you may notice is that the siding material on the regular part of the building, not the warehouse part of the building, is different. So we talked about a few slides back about how the original siding on the building was like a tongue and groove, old growth Doug-fir siding that was painted. And then it started getting added onto in different ways. And pad wood siding at some point in its life on most areas, except for the warehouse portion, has always had some sort of galvanized metal siding and wood siding on the first floor. But during the World War II, there was a surplus of random building materials during and after World War II. And one of them was composite roofing shingles, also known as asphalt roofing shingles, that were, believe it or not, used as an exterior building. Like people decided, what I can do with that? Just put it on top of my old Doug-fir T&G and it'll look beautiful, which is hard to imagine. And yet this building, this photo here is actually showing painted asphalt shingle siding as the siding material, where it looks kind of like, I'm not sure you can tell from right there, but from further away, it looks kind of like a cedar shake or something. It's not. I wish it were. That would be cool. But those were supplied it wasn't that impressive, because most of them a lot of them are still there, and I can still tell who, and maybe not who. I wish I knew who installed them, because I have things to say to them. But in the 60s, sort of infamous Columbus Day storm came through this area and caused a ton of damage to existing architecture and just built environments, as well as landscaping and things like that. And it turns out that asphalt shingle siding just blows off of the building when there's like hurricane-like winds going around. So many of these asphalt shingles were blown off of the building, which we don't have a photo of this, but I can imagine it looked pretty horrible at that point. And the owners at the time were like, oh, I have a great idea. So instead of taking off the asphalt shingles and, doing something beautiful, instead, we can kill two birds with one stone. And we can use this old galvanized metal siding, which thankfully is kind of an attractive thing, that we found for some other place. It has nail holes all in it, not where it's currently being nailed. So we know that it's at least in its second life. And we can put it up to cover all of the parts of the siding. And we'll just leave whatever's there, that half blown off or whatever. And it's even better, it'll save us money because all these window panes of glass that have been shattered by the Columbus Day storm, we're just not going to actually fix them. We're going to just take all the ones that look fine, put them in the upper sash of the 4/4 windows, and then we're going to use metal siding. We're going to cover the bottom half of all the windows. And it's going to be perfect. No one will ever know. And that is how it's been since the 60s. So they might have been right, unfortunately. And so it makes the windows look square and squatty. And when you're inside the building, there's also literally half of the natural light that should exist in there. There's also just a lot of wonky, like you can tell it was the bottom sash of a window, but it got turned into a top sash, and then somebody put a little plexiglass in there, and there's a little bit of Russian roulette figuring out what in the world was ever going on. But the building, since the 60s, has really not been altered at all. And even before that, it really hadn't been altered, except for the weird sunken window situation, we shall call it.
So I'm just going to real quickly, maybe should have started with this, but when we talk about the Mary Beth language of how we describe this building, just give you a quick little tour inside my brain, which is kind of a scary place. But so this is, we're standing in the back parking lot. We're literally just standing in the middle of the parking lot in the rear of the building. And where this arrow is pointing and our fancy yellow dashed lines is pointing to the load out bends, which I talked about a little bit earlier of how you could actually have your vehicle, you could come underneath there. There would actually be hatches of then processed material that would open, would dump, would fill out the back of your truck or wagon, and then you would leave and go back to your farm, or not really your farm, probably to where you were then selling your processed goods. The other thing that's interesting about this photograph here is that you'll see two examples of rehabilitated windows to what they are supposed to look like. So these two windows here, and sorry, I misspoke before, that we covered up the top window panes of the double hung, not the bottom. But this is what they should look like in, within reason. And this is kind of what we're left with instead, which is strikingly different. And then come down here, when we look at it from 5th Street towards more Lafayette Avenue, you'll see this is what we call the warehouse. So it's a 2-story, the second story is very large ceilings with those trusses that I call trusses, but somebody might disagree, in here. And then this is that original building with that original roof line here that we pointed out before. The western addition, and then the 5th story addition as it exists today. And this kind of explains all of those. Okay, this picture would have been better for what I just said. Pretend like I just said everything, but I said it down. And showing you the kind of addition of how these things happened. That we have our 1888 original building, the additions that were then added on the west, and on the top 5th story, the warehouse addition built in 1937, and then in 1947, the roof of it and the original top structure was actually taken off, and it was raised up and made bigger and beefed up structurally by really heavy timber from the Tillamook Burn forest fires, which, if I recall, lasted for decades, and is actually kind of amazing that any of us, well, not that we exist, but that we exist living where we are today, because the legislators out in Oregon and in the Northwest after the Tillamook burns very seriously considered like why in the world would it be safe for anyone to live in this area of the country, like ever again? We should all just like move out and leave. And thankfully someone had the wherewithal to be like, there could be another way to strategize this. But so it was a devastating series of forest fires, but we're left with some beauty from it, and that salvaged really old growth Doug fir, like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of year old trees, were used to actually make these huge beams that are 22 inches wide and 36 inches tall. So like they're as deep as the width of all of your interior doors in here, that support the floor, the second floor of the warehouse. And when you go to Buchanan Cellars, you can actually you can touch it and see it. It's really, really remarkable. And this is looking at kind of west side of the building, kind of as it is now, which is in need of a little TLC, which we are aware of. And then just the views of the building, in case some people haven't really been over to that area or haven't in a while, but this is looking at the building from like the Lafayette Avenue and 5th Street intersection. And this would be looking at it from Irvine Avenue, so moving more towards historic downtown 3rd Street, and then looking straight at it down Irvine and 4th Street. And this is just the view of the building, kind of back the big intersections right by the grain station and the beginning of the Alpine Avenue development. Problem, these are not necessarily the most exciting pictures. I'm gonna just flip through real quick and see if there's anything. Oh, here we go, this is fun. Okay, so there are 5 stories we've talked about in the building and a basement. So actually there's 6 stories. And this is a photograph of the basement. I think I took this in 2020, so it still looks exactly the same. That is tall enough to stand and actually be in. This will be my really odd picture and segue into, for the last number of years, I, along with the Leagard family and a team of engineers who want to kill me most days, but that's okay, have been working really hard on it's a rehabilitation project is what it would be called for this building. So in historic preservation, and this language becomes very important when you talk about buildings that are listed on the National Register, there's 2 different kind of approved ways to try to treat a historic building. One is restoration, and that's like you're picking an exact date of time in history during its period of significance, and you are restoring the building like exactly to the way it was at that period in time. And sometimes that's a really appropriate thing to do, particularly for, you think of like the Arlene Schnitzer Music Hall downtown Portland, so really old like theaters or buildings like that where they're still very much used actually for the way they were intended to be used when they were first built. And so it's a lot about restoring exactly what's there before. We have a unique building in that if you restored this building exactly to the way that it was, it would be difficult to pick a time period because you're like, well, do I do 1888 and then I tear down half of the building that's there because that didn't exist then? Do I pick it in the 60s and then I'm gonna put, is it before I put metal siding or is it after? I'm gonna put asphalt shingles. It doesn't quite work with the building's history, and it doesn't really work with the way that the building can then be used for adaptive reuse to have a life for the next 135 plus years. And so we are a rehabilitation project, which means that you still strive in every possible way to protect the exterior of the building from its period of significance, meaning I don't have to keep the windows at their little tiny squares, right? I get to bring them back to when they mattered and were most original and beautiful. And you protect the things that are the most defining historic characteristics of the building. So inside the big heavy timber post and beams, for example, and the windows from the inside, the wood floors are 1.5 inches thick and original to the building on every single floor. Those are things that are defining characteristics. But you're able to work within that to try to rehab the space to something that has a new or hybrid new use so that it can be used and cherished and taken care of and be income producing, because it turns out these things cost money, and we want to make sure that it will always have a way to produce income so that when the Leagard family is no longer here, some other family will, or trust will be able to protect it forever and ever and ever. So the basement, what's cool about the rehabilitation part of it is that we get to open up these spaces that have never been used really for anything other than storing big molasses tanks, which if you get to be a part of our family, then you get to learn things like molasses tanks and augers and things nobody ever thought that this lady here would know about in my adult life. And so the plans for rehabilitation are to open up all of the square footage of the existing building to maintain the retail space for Buchanan Cellars, at least on the first floor, likely creeping into a part of the second floor. Fun plans to actually open up like a mezzanine kind of hole in the second floor in the warehouse building, so you'll be able to see all the way through and have a big staircase coming up, while maintaining and bringing back the exterior to its like original, really beautiful charm. The plans also include adding in, we talked about those crib bins with the 2x4 construction, or I was like acting out how someone literally built it just going like this. That we are opening up those spaces, because right now they're just storage bins, to having actual usable square footage on every floor, and inside those, because they are in the back of the building and actually run from the basement, right now up to the 4th floor, we're extending it up to the 5th floor, which is the only change on the exterior we're making of the building envelope, to have a fully ADA accessible elevator access for all floors, and fire egress and all those kind of things. That will also serve as the new sort of main entrance to the building, which maybe makes a little bit more sense than parking on the street with the loadout bins on 5th Street. But I'd like to remind everyone that when you're shopping at Buchanan Cellars, you will forever be allowed to just park in the middle of the street on the loading dock and call and have someone bring the things to the back of your car, which we're thankful for living in a small town like McMinnville, where the planners think that's totally normal. So this is the basement that will be cleaned up, opened up. We're cutting holes into some of these concrete foundation walls to make this a larger, more usable space for actually potentially some more like opportunities for fun spaces in the future. So is it like a whiskey bar or a place for private events or music or something like that? I like to describe it as a bigger version of the cellar bar at McMinnville's, but where you can actually stand like all the way up. So that is pretty fun. And then McMinnville's is a beautiful building. I'm very, very thankful for it. But my little other jab at it is that Buchanan Cellars is the tallest building in McMinnville today. Taller than all of the other buildings. There aren't that many competitors. That it is approaching 80 feet in height, but it is not quite there. I want to say it's about 76'10" from its sort of main floor level, if you will, or what we call grade when we talk about construction. This is another photo of the basement. You can see some of these really heavy joists in the floor above. Just kind of flip through here. This is a photo showing the bottom of those crib bins and how they come to the poured concrete foundation. And then we do a kind of big jump to just showing, this is an example or kind of more recent photo of the retail space on the main floor, which actually isn't really that updated because CB has, it's much more open and beautiful down there. There's new point of sale stations where in this photo, when you came in the back door, you couldn't kind of walk all the way through. This has all been shifted and moved, and so it actually feels quite a bit different than it does in this photo, which is where I also put in my little cue for like, remember we sell pet food, and price match. I think that's true. I don't know. I like to say things and then CB has to deal with the things. This is a photo of the first floor retail space and those huge beams I was talking about that were salvaged from the Tillamook forest fires. This is an example of that, but I want you to imagine, or not imagine, this is really what it is. This is the bottom of the beam. The top of the beam actually goes all the way up here. These joists are on hangers hanging off of the side of the beam, so it's really, really significant. Another view of those big, large beams that are exposed. This is a really fun picture of on the first floor still, but where I talked about you can walk all the way through the first floor and be like, oh, this is how they built something in 1888. This was in 1924. This is in 1945. This is the original post and beam structure of the 1888 building. And so you'll notice that instead of having a bunch of metal brackets or things like that, it has like wooden dowels, and it's really interesting construction. And then kind of right adjacent to it is when they added on the western part of the warehouse addition, and it has more of a modern, if you will, although it's still 80-something years old in the making of how those guys are put together. So just more pictures of that retail space and the post and beam structure and all of the joists up above. You see these sort of whitewashed joists over in the top left corner that are some of the original older joists, and then the flooring shifts to where the newer western part of the building is. Another photo example of what we talk about, the really defining characteristics of the building, that the floors are one of those really defining characteristics too, and they're really, really gorgeous, even if they're not maybe the cleanest. This is an example. It's a little cleaned out now. I need to take some new ones for my, it's only cleaned out because Stevie started working at Buchanan Cellars and she got it cleaned out and it needed it, as you can tell, very badly. But on the second floor of the warehouse portion of the building that's not open to really the public right now for any use other than storage, this is inside that warehouse portion, and you can see how just enormous amount of space there is up there. This, which served as a Taekwondo studio, oddly, for a little while, is the northern edition of the warehouse building. So this is the part that's facing the back of the building, and where the roof comes down and is a little bit shallower. Another view from the Taekwondo studio. I need to get some new pictures, or some old ones. And this is of those trusses that, I mean, they are trusses and they're very beautiful, but they are going to need some beefing up to bring us up to code compliance. Another picture of those beautiful trusses and the ceiling exposed underneath with the wood decking, which will remain exposed. We're going to add like rigid foam insulation on top of the structure, so we'll remove the asphalt shingles, we'll add all of the structural things and insulation on top of the roof, put that back down, and so from the inside, the ceiling and the roof will actually look exactly the same, but a little bit shinier version of itself than it is today. Another photo of the old floors, and then this is also just some fun photos showing, this is some of the old original burlap bagging equipment, so they're like sewing machines on their side, they have little scales built into them. They would weigh them and then sew the tops of the bag, and also showing our sad little window behind there with the top sash covered with the metal galvanized siding. This is a wall showing you where there's the original fir shiplap siding behind the structure. This is also, the engineers love for me to point out, this is a great example of a wall assembly in the building where we played a game called Can You Find a Stud that starts at the floor and goes all the way up to the ceiling without being broken? And I have a hint for you. No, you cannot. Another photo on the second floor, so we've moved out of the warehouse portion and we're in the mill portion of the buildings, which is where all the real milling happened. And most of that equipment is still there. We will be kind of keeping treasured sort of older pieces of equipment displayed in publicly accessible areas of the building as we move through these things, but we're also hoping some of the other pieces of equipment that we won't have home for might be able to find a home with the more local societies that take care of McMinnville's history, and we're going to kind of work with people to find good homes for all of those. These are the rickety stairs to which, if you've been on a tour with me, you have braved, and it is a workout for sure. It's like not really easy. Another picture of some of the milling equipment up on the third floor. And actually, if you look, sorry, I'm kind of going a little long here. Anyone wants to see what my text messages are for the day? This is an example of where that original fir siding is on the inside of that building on the west wall. So they built that shed roof structure out to the side, but you still like have that original part of the building there, and that's looking at it from the other direction. So this up here is the old window holes that we looked at in that construction photograph. And other everyone's just looking back, this is still on that third floor, which is a really cool, this is that western addition on the third floor that we were just talking about, but taken more towards the kind of brain station area of that side of the building, if you will. This is taking it from the 5th Street side of the interior. The 4th floor is a lot of metal bends and hard to find floor space to exist in. But the ceilings get taller and the floor plans get smaller as you move up. So the 4th floor is actually, once the renovation and stuff is all completed, I think is going to be my favorite floor, which everyone thinks is weird when you're in the tour because you squeeze between these grates and get spider webs everywhere. But it has these just fantastically high ceilings, and because it's a smaller footprint, the windows like really bring in a lot of light to this center of the space as well. And then the 5th story is this whitewashed kind of interior where you can see we don't have the post and beam heavy timber structure anymore because this was built at a later time period. And there's lots of big gears and crazy pieces of equipment up there. These things that look like funnels. I forget, Margaret used to call them, they're like, we call them like tornado funnels or something, but they were dust collectors. So it was all things to try to prevent fire hazards from happening, which was such a big issue. There's a catwalk kind of area up on the 5th floor to access some equipment there and a ladder there. The intention is for that kind of catwalk area to stay, but just to be looked at. And then all of these crazy chutes and ladders and things like that we talked about. You know, you'd get that raw material, come in the little metal scoops, go in those elevator legs, go all the way up to the 5th floor. Well, now we're at the 5th floor, and there's all these levers, and you can kind of see, or when you get up here closer, there's these wires everywhere that are like from the 5th floor to the 3rd floor, and somebody on the 3rd floor would pull on this wire, and it would open this hatch on this piece right here, and then that would decide what's going to go into what piece of equipment. It's really remarkable that anybody ever got it right. And then this is actually just kind of going back to the 1st floor. The last thing that I will end with, and I'll try not to make anybody dizzy, is, so this is a kind of just computer rendering of what the building, it also includes the basement, so just pretend like we have a ground here, right? But what the building, what we hope it will look like when we are done with the rehabilitation. And so bringing back, you know, the beautiful double hung windows, we hope to reuse a lot of the metal galvanized siding and replace as needed the wood siding that's down on the 1st floor. The idea is to really clean up this west side of the building here. This is the alley, is right here, if you will, and have an actual usable like outdoor kind of patio space on that loading dock area right now. This is also kind of a fun thing. We talked about the loadout bins on some of those pictures. If anyone remembers, it's amazing by now, but we're infilling the bottom part of that loadout bin so that this is actually like another way to access the building using some more space that's not available, adding floors inside these loadout bins that are just bins, right? So they don't have usable floor space. So that the 2nd and 3rd floor actually have these kind of semi-indoor, outdoor spaces out here. So these are kind of like a hybrid glass, like garage door, but just at partial height. So the whole thing can open up and it's like a covered patio space there. And the rear of the building is where the most significant changes happen in terms of adding windows, because there's really pretty much no windows back there now, and we are keeping the south side of the building, so the 5th Street facade. The idea is to really keep that really untouched from its original plan and only add fenestration and glazing along the north side, which is not as public of a view. And then the new main entrance will actually be from the parking lot, these double doors back here. Okay, I don't even know. I'm gonna put up something that's probably kind of confusing, but it might make more sense when I'll kind of wrap up here, but people can come up and look around. So this is like a section cut of the buildings. We're going to take like a big slice of it down its long ways in the middle. This is the east side of the building, so like Lafayette, right, is over here. 5th Street is here. We're cutting it in half to be able to see the kind of structure that's existing there on each floor that we plan on keeping. And then if you get close enough and don't get dizzy looking at all the lines, you can also come up here and see where we plan on adding a kind of big interior staircase and opening up the 2nd floor of this big warehouse part of it as well. So yeah. There we are.
Mary, I have a question.
Yes.
So, did it suffer any damage from the earthquake in '93?
You know what's interesting?
You know, because I see everything, all the joints
Right.
still look tight when I go in there. Oh, sorry.
It's really, so as far, I don't, do you want to repeat it for other people?
Yeah, my question is, did you see any damage from the earthquake in '93? Because that was the highest we've ever had, 5.6, and even bridge was taken down at the time in Dayton. And when I walk through there, you know, when I go in there and get my sunflower seed, and I look at the beams, and I go, God, all the joints still look really tight. Anyway, go ahead.
Now, what's interesting is that there actually isn't any evidence that there was damage to the building in that earthquake, which I can't decide if it's really surprising or not surprising at all. But the foundation of this building itself is like, everything was built so largely because the equipment it was built to hold was so heavy, right? And so it's so completely overbuilt in some ways structurally for anything it would ever be used for today, while at the same time being completely underbuilt actually in terms of seismic protection. And so while I say there's no evidence that that damaged it, I will also say that if there were to be a large seismic event, this building would be in a lot of trouble. And the biggest issue with that is that it's actually, we talk about them as like kind of separate buildings where I'm like, there's the warehouse and there's the mill and there's the crib bins and there's the loadout bins and there's the west side addition. So none of those are actually connected to each other structurally, like their siding is the same, but when you go into the building, and that'll be your homework for anyone that shops there, is to go in there and look at the difference when, if you're on the 1st floor here in the kind of retail space with the older framed, the whitewashed buildings, and then you move over into the larger warehouse structure with those really big beams. Every time the building shifts from like one building to then an expansion of another building, there's like this 1 3/4 to 2 1/4 inch gap between the structures. So there'll be like the post for this, and then the post for this, and they're not connected. The crib bins are the same way in the back. There's an 1 3/4 gap between them. And so I think that we've been lucky that there hasn't been seismic activity that has shifted enough, because this building would not move as one unit. It would move separately, and separate buildings just smash into each other. And so, but that being said, she has outlived all of us. It seems to be doing something really well, too. That's a great question, though. Yeah.
What kind of fire suppression equipment do you have in there?
So what's interesting is that right now, there is actually a really old fire suppression system that runs through the whole building that has, where it doesn't have sprinkler heads per se in most locations, but like there's actual, what'd you call that, a fire hose, right, would come and be like attached on each floor within the structure. And so the plan for the new kind of rehabilitated version is that it would be a fully sprinklered building. We actually think we'll be able to reuse some of those existing water lines for the sprinkler, which I think is kind of cool. And when they redid 5th Street and repaved it feels like it was like last year, it was not last year. We thought through that in advance and worked with the city, so we actually, Buchanan Sellers and the family paid to have a new water line and new sprinkler line put in under 5th Street coming into the building so that we don't have to rip up 5th Street.
Wait, just raise your hand and I'll bring you the microphone.
Great.
So you go pick it.
Oh, I'm bad at this. Everybody go, yeah.
where was the mill and how was it powered?
So
And also, is the scale still operative?
the scale is still there. I can't,
I don't know if it's.
it goes back and forth between being functioning or being broken by probably my children, but I'll blame it on someone else's badly behaved kids. And actually, so on the first floor of the building, there is a really old metal floor scale that still exists. It will always exist. And if it's actually totally working or calibrated correctly, that I don't know, but I do know that it's there and usually working. And then your other question, was about power. So,
Well, about the mill, where
Yes.
was the mill?
yeah, so what's interesting about this building, right, is that it wasn't a grist mill, so it wasn't powered by water, right? It didn't need to be located near river or stream, and I don't know anything about a grist mill except for that one sentence, so don't follow up with any further questions. But this building's, the location, why it was placed the way that it is that it was right by the railroad tracks, and that was the big reason and connection for its location. It had an original coal burning boiler room in its basement that actually still exists and is the only place asbestos lives in the building, thank goodness, but not going to take you on a tour to that boiler room. So it was first powered by an old boiler room in the basement. That switched over to a boiler in the west loading dock, which has actually been removed for a while. But an interesting factoid about McMinnville, and I don't have the exact date, it's somewhere in these packets, but it was one of the first cities, like McMinnville, Oregon, on the west coast to actually have power, electric power that powered the
That was
city.
across the street, was it?
The power plant, yep. So which was Elizabeth Chambers, and then I don't know what it's called now. That's terrible. And McMinnville, actual residential streets and commercial streets, in the very early 1900s, actually had power lines in power before metropolitan cities did. Is kind of interesting. And so we were very hip and on the forefront of technology. And we still have the original circuit breaker rooms are still there. We still use actually a really old electrical panel that works totally fine. But if you ever get a chance to come and take a tour, we arrange something to see that, and we'll make sure to keep that when the building is rehabilitated too. There's when your circuit breaker flips at your house and you have to go and flick the switch. We have some where the switch is this thing. It's whoom. So there's a lot of power to the building. Yes.
Yes, where is the elevator going to be that you said would be on it?
So the elevator is going to be on the cribbed bin area along the back. So let me see. Well, here. I'll just show you on the outside. So if we're on the front of the building, then we flip around here. So we talked about, so this here is that loadout bin area. These windows here, this kind of section of the building, is where the existing crib bins are with those 2x4 wall construction that runs from the basement, partially up to the 4th floor right now. And so this is the one part of the building that we're actually expanding the exterior envelope, changing the shape of the building in order to bring the new elevator all the way up to the 5th floor. The main fire stair will also be in here. And so on each floor, there's kind of the main little entry. There's a lobby area, the elevator, and the main fire egress stair. Yes?
What's the time frame?
What a great question.
She said time frame.
Yes. I keep answering that question, and then I keep not hitting my deadlines. So we are, I've done a lot of the architectural drawings for the project and the interior kind of layout and things like that, and am still and have been for a couple of years now working with our structural engineers on finishing up our engineering plans. So we really, really hope it should be submitted for permitting, at least getting into that. That will be a 2023 thing for sure.
It's on, I think, it's on.
Better be.
My name is Dolores Fanning. I live on about 15 miles from here on a century farm. I have been a farmer's wife for 67 years. And in the course of it, my husband did not like to drive trucks. He would drive the tractors and the combines, and then he would dump it in the truck. There was no air conditioning, there was no power steering, and I had a truck that would drive to several mills, and one was to Buchanan cellars.
Oh, wow.
So I would drive in this pit, and it was very dusty, and they would, and none of our trucks had automatic hoists. So you drove up on a metal frame that had big cables, and it would lift the front of the truck up, and they would open the butt in and dump the seed. I mostly haul to Buchanan cellars would be wheat, barley, oats, and sometimes some hairy vetch, depending on different mills what they would have for their cleaners. But I knew Mr. Sellers very well, and it was interesting to see how dusty it was, very dusty. And sometimes it would plug up some of those big pipes that went up there. So they would go up these ladders and bang on them, try to get it to go up and through. And every one they had to switch to different places for different bins according to what seeds you had. So it was an interesting time, but I enjoyed it, but it was hard. It was sweaty and hot, and if you had barley, it was itchy.
That is so amazing. And so just so you know, if you ever need to take a field trip, and you can still pull under the loadout bin area, that's actually where the accessible parking spot is right now with the ramp up to the back door. And if you look up, you'll see the gears and joists that would have lifted the front of that vehicle. They are still up on the ceiling there. That's amazing. And you look way too young for any of that to I should be in that kind of work, I guess.
My question has to do with a building that I've seen. I used to live in Carlton, and there's a building in Carlton that says Buchanan Cellars. Is it related in any way?
I used to know the real answer to that. It's certainly the same people. So the Buchanan and Sellers were the last names of two owners, and they bought it. Actually, I have this written down because that wasn't the original owners, but they owned it for a long time. So Buchanan and Co., which was before he joined with Sellers, bought it in 1918, and it had been called the Huck Milling Company before that. But there's actually, and you'll have to come up here and see, I have a whole one-pager, which is just the history of the Buchanan Sellers Grain Company itself, because it didn't actually start in McMinnville, but they owned different operations all over the state. And so and actually what's funny, I think we have a little painting of that building at the retail store, but I always walk by it being who did? And I'm that's not the right building, but it's the one in Carlton. So I think it was an extension of a location for the Buchanan Sellers Company.
Thank you.
Well, I want to thank you so much for what a wonderful historical background of here. We'll have you, Chuck. So we need to call a halt, but I'm sure she will answer some questions close up. So thank you again, Mary Beth. This is wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. And here we go. Thank you. Bye-bye.